January 1945. The Colmar Pocket, Alsace, France. The fog rolls thick across the frozen Rhine Valley like a burial shroud, muting the world into shades of ash and bone. In the skeletal remains of what was once a French farmhouse, a young American soldier lies motionless behind a splintered window frame, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. His hands, stiff with cold, cradle a Springfield M1903A4 sniper rifle, a weapon he has come to know intimately, not for its precision, but for its profound inadequacy. The stock is cracked near the receiver. The scope, a Weaver 330C, refuses to hold zero for more than a handful of shots. Every time he fires, he must recalculate, re-estimate, trust something beyond the mechanics of steel and glass. His name is Private First Class Francis Marion Curry, though history would remember him differently, incompletely. Around him, the winter war grinds forward with mechanical indifference. The metallic clatter of distant artillery punctuates the silence. Somewhere beyond the fog, German soldiers from the 19th Army hold their defensive positions with the desperation of men who know the war is lost but cannot yet surrender. And here, in this moment of cold and uncertainty, a singular truth begins to take shape. That warfare, in its most distilled form, is not about the perfection of tools, but the resolve of the hand that wields them. The frost creeps across the inside of the broken window, forming crystalline patterns that catch what little light penetrates the winter gloom. Curry has been in position for 4 hours, and the cold has worked its way through his wool uniform, through the layers of undershirt and field jacket, settling into his bones with patient malice. His feet, wrapped in 2 pairs of socks inside boots that are slightly too large, have lost most sensation. This is normal now. The cold is a constant companion, as present as his rifle, as reliable as the sunrise he can no longer see through the perpetual fog. He does not move except to breathe, and even his breathing he controls, shallow, measured, never deep enough to create visible clouds that might catch a German observer's attention. In his mind, he runs through calculations that have become second nature: wind speed estimated from the movement of bare branches, temperature's effect on bullet trajectory, the particular quirks of his rifle that make it shoot 6 inches left at 200 meters, but 4 inches right at 300. These are not the calculations they taught him at Camp Perry. These are the adjustments he has discovered through trial and bitter error, through shots that missed and revealed his position, through near-death experiences that taught him his weapon's personality more thoroughly than any manual could. The Colmar Pocket represented one of the last significant German-held territories in France, a stubborn bulge of resistance that jutted into Allied lines like an infected tooth. By January 1945, the Wehrmacht's strategic position across Europe had deteriorated into organized collapse. The Red Army pressed from the east with merciless momentum. British and American forces tightened their grip from the west. Yet here, in this frozen triangle of Alsatian territory, elements of the German 19th Army under General Siegfried Rasp refused to yield. The pocket stretched roughly 50 kilometers north to south, 30 kilometers east to west, a compressed battlefield where every meter of ground had been contested, abandoned, retaken, and contested again. The villages of Alsace, Gebsheim, Grossenheim, Kunheim, Biesheim, became names written in blood and frozen mud, places where American infantry learned that German soldiers, even in defeat, remained among the most tactically proficient adversaries in military history. For the American Sixth Corps and the French First Army, tasked with eliminating this resistance, the Colmar offensive became a brutal education in winter warfare that would cost over 18,000 casualties before its conclusion. The German defenders, many of them veterans cycled from the Eastern Front, understood defensive warfare with grim expertise. They had learned their trade in the crucible of the Russian campaign, where defensive positions meant the difference between survival and annihilation, where German lines absorbed Soviet assaults that came in waves of men and steel that seemed inexhaustible. These were not the enthusiastic soldiers of 1940 who had rolled through France in 6 weeks. These were hard men, survivors of Stalingrad's aftermath, of the fighting retreat through Ukraine and Poland, of the knowledge that every kilometer they yielded brought the war closer to German soil, to their families, to the reckoning that awaited. They transformed the villages and forests of Alsace into interlocking kill zones with practiced efficiency of men who had done this before, who understood fields of fire and mutual support, who knew exactly how to position a single machine gun to command an entire approach route. They knew the terrain, they knew the ranges, they knew that every day they held was another day the Reich survived, another day their families remained behind German lines rather than Soviet occupation. For the American sniper units deployed into this frozen theater, the mission parameters were deceptively simple: eliminate enemy command and control, disrupt logistics, create psychological pressure through precision violence. But the reality proved far more complex. The equipment issued to U.S. Army snipers in early 1945 reflected a military procurement system still learning the nuances of specialized warfare. The M1903A4 rifle, while descended from a proven platform that had served American forces since 1903, was hastily adapted for the sniper role. The Weaver scopes mounted to these weapons were civilian hunting optics pressed into military service, never designed for the punishment of sustained combat operations. Manufacturing tolerances varied wildly between units. Some rifles shot true, others, like the one Curry carried, seemed almost cursed, temperamental, unreliable, requiring constant compensation for mechanical drift. Aramists did what they could with limited resources, but in forward positions there was no replacing a faulty weapon. The supply chain that could deliver hot meals and ammunition in abundance somehow could not produce sufficient numbers of properly functioning sniper rifles. You adapted, or you failed. There was no third option. Curry grew up in rural Pennsylvania, the son of a coal miner, raised in a landscape of hardship that taught patience before it taught hope. His father descended into the mines each morning before dawn and emerged after sunset, a life lived in darkness punctuated by the constant threat of collapse, explosion, or the slow death of black lung. The family lived in a company town where the coal company owned the houses, the store, and effectively the souls of everyone who worked the seams. Poverty was not occasional, but structural, a permanent condition that shaped every decision. He learned to shoot with his grandfather's ancient rifle, a weapon so old that its manufacturer no longer existed, hunting deer in the Appalachian foothills, where a clean kill meant the difference between eating and going hungry. You learned patience, learned to wait for the perfect shot, learned that marksmanship was not sport, but survival translated into skill. His grandfather, a man of few words who himself had survived the First World War, taught him to read wind by watching grass, to judge distance by understanding how terrain compressed perspective, to know his weapon so intimately that aiming became instinctive. When he enlisted in 1943, the Army recognized something in his rifle scores during basic training, a consistency that suggested instinct rather than mere practice. While other recruits fired in clusters, some shots good, others wild, Curry's targets showed a mechanical precision that caught the attention of range instructors. They selected him for specialized sniper training at Camp Perry, Ohio, where instructors drilled into him the cold mathematics of trajectory, windage, and breath control. He learned to calculate bullet drop across distance, to compensate for the Coriolis effect at extreme range, to read mirage and use it to gauge wind at the target rather than the firing position. He learned camouflage and concealment, how to construct hides that were invisible even from meters away. how to move without creating the micro-movements that human eyes instinctively detect. He learned the psychology of patience, how to remain motionless for hours, how to control the biological urges that would compromise a position. But no amount of training prepared him for the specific betrayal of defective equipment. In training, the rifles worked, the scopes held their calibration, the instructors emphasized trusting your weapon, developing confidence in your equipment. Every principle they taught assumed mechanical reliability as a foundation. In the Colmar pocket, nothing worked as promised. His rifle's wandering zero meant that a target at 300 meters required not just calculation but intuition, a kind of second sight developed through repeated failure and adjustment. The scope would hold zero for perhaps a dozen shots, then inexorably shift. Sometimes the shift was gradual, a slow drift that he could track through observation. Other times it was sudden, dramatic, a shot that should have been center mass, instead impacting a meter high and right. He learned to fire a ranging shot when possible, using expendable targets, fence posts, tree trunks, to check where the rifle was shooting that day, that hour. He learned to keep a mental log of the weapon's behavior, noting patterns that might predict the next shift. He learned to cross-reference the scope with his instinctive understanding of holdover and windage, using the optic as one data point among several rather than as gospel truth. Most importantly, he learned to trust himself more than his equipment, to understand that the weapon was merely an extension of his will, that accuracy resided not in the mechanical precision of the rifle, but in his ability to compensate for its inadequacy. The German soldiers entrenched across from American positions in January 1945 came from a military culture that venerated precision. Wehrmacht marksmanship training emphasized mechanical excellence, the correct way to hold a weapon, the proper breathing technique, the disciplined trigger squeeze taught through endless repetition until it became muscle memory impervious to combat stress. German snipers, particularly those trained under the Scharfschützen program, were issued purpose-built rifles, the Karabiner 98K with Zeiss optics, weapons engineered to exacting standards by a nation that prided itself on technical excellence. The Zeiss scopes were legendary for their clarity and precision, optical instruments that represented the apex of German engineering. These were not hunting scopes adapted for war, but military optics designed from inception for the specific requirements of battlefield use. They held zero through thousands of rounds. They performed in extreme temperatures. They represented the German philosophy that superior equipment, properly employed, would overcome numerical disadvantage. German snipers expected their American adversaries to be similarly equipped, perhaps even better. German intelligence had documented American industrial capacity with a mixture of awe and dread, the endless factories that produced tanks, aircraft, artillery in quantities that defied comprehension. The intelligence reports circulated through Wehrmacht command structures painted a picture of American manufacturing that seemed almost supernatural in its scope. Entire factories the size of small cities, producing bombers on assembly lines like automobiles. Shipyards that launched new vessels weekly, an industrial capacity that by 1944 exceeded that of all Axis powers combined. Surely, German soldiers reasoned, American snipers would carry rifles of corresponding quality, state-of-the-art optics, flawless mechanical precision, the weaponized expression of American manufacturing supremacy. This assumption shaped their tactical behavior. They took calculated risks, exposing themselves for brief moments, confident that American counter-sniper capabilities, while present, operated within known parameters. A German sniper understood that his American counterpart might match him in skill, might even exceed him in some technical aspect, but both operated under the same fundamental constraints of distance, trajectory, and human reaction time. What they did not anticipate was an American sniper who had learned to transcend his equipment's limitations, who had alchemized deficiency into advantage through sheer adaptive persistence. Curry's first confirmed kill in the Colmar pocket came on January 18, 1945, during a German probe toward American positions outside the village of Jebsheim. The attack came at dawn, German infantry moving through the fog with the disciplined coordination that characterized Wehrmacht tactical doctrine. A Wehrmacht officer, identifiable by his distinctive cap and the way soldiers deferred to his positioning, emerged from a tree line at approximately 280 meters. Through his scope, even with its imperfect optics, Curry could see details, the officer consulting a map, gesturing to soldiers flanking him, the way he carried himself with the confidence of command. Curry settled behind his rifle, feeling the familiar imperfections, the crack in the stock that made the weapon's balance slightly off. The scope that he knew from yesterday's ranging shots was currently shooting 4 inches right at this distance. He compensated, aiming for the officer's left shoulder to hit center mass, exhaled halfway to stabilize his diaphragm, and squeezed the trigger with the smooth pressure his grandfather had taught him decades before. The Springfield barked, the recoil sharp against his shoulder, and through the scope, already losing zero from the shot's vibration and recoil, he saw the officer crumple forward, the map falling from his hands. The German soldiers around the fallen officer scattered, but their training made them predictable. They moved to cover following doctrinal responses that Curry had observed in previous engagements. He cycled the bolt with practiced speed, the action smooth despite the rifle's other flaws, brass ejecting in a glinting arc. He reacquired through the scope, found a soldier who had paused behind insufficient cover, compensated again, the zero had shifted from the first shot's impact, now shooting 5 inches right instead of 4, and fired a second time. The soldier dropped. Then, a third shot, and another figure collapsed, and the survivors vanished into the trees, their probe broken before it properly began. 3 shots, 3 kills, from a weapon that by all technical standards should not have been capable of consistent accuracy. But Curry had stopped trusting the scope weeks earlier. He had learned to use it as a reference point rather than gospel, cross-checking with iron sight alignment, with his instinctive read of distance and wind, with the accumulated knowledge of his weapon's particular pathology. The rifle was, yes, faulty, but it was consistently faulty in ways he had cataloged and could predict, and consistency, even in deficiency, could be mastered. The historical record of Curry's service in the Colmar pocket is fragmentary, pieced together from unit after-action reports, scattered commendations, and the terse notations in regimental logs that reduced human drama to bureaucratic prose. The 30th Infantry Division, to which his unit was attached, fought through some of the heaviest defensive fighting of the Western European campaign during January and February 1945. German resistance in the pocket was fanatic in places, pragmatic in others, but always tenacious, reflecting the Wehrmacht institutional culture of aggressive defense. American casualties mounted steadily. Frostbite cases sometimes exceeded combat injuries in field hospitals. The winter cold added a layer of suffering that transcended enemy action, a misery that was democratic in its distribution, affecting everyone regardless of rank or specialty. Men lost toes to frostbite. Trenchfoot became epidemic among infantry holding waterlogged positions. Pneumonia and exposure-related illness filled hospital beds that were needed for wounded soldiers. In this environment, snipers operated under conditions that tested both skill and endurance in equal measure. Days spent motionless in hides, waiting for targets that might never appear. Nights shivering in unheated ruins, unable to light fires that would draw artillery. The psychological weight of killing at distance, where the enemy's face is visible through magnification, where death is delivered with deliberation rather than the chaotic impersonality of artillery or automatic fire, where each killing is a conscious choice repeated across minutes of careful preparation. By the end of January, Curry's tally had climbed into the 20s, 23 confirmed eliminations documented in the precise language of after-action reports. His company commander, a captain who had been a high school teacher before the war and approached military documentation with academic thoroughness, began assigning him to specific missions beyond the standard counter-sniper work. Eliminate the machine gun crew at grid reference such and such. Interdict the enemy supply route at this junction. Cover the infantry advance across this particular field where German positions commanded the approach. Each mission demanded adaptation, required Curry to solve a unique tactical puzzle with his imperfect tool. The rifle's point of impact continued to drift, never catastrophically enough to render it useless, but enough that he could never simply aim and fire with the confidence that training had promised. He developed a pre-engagement ritual. Before each mission, if circumstances allowed, he would fire a single ranging shot on a target of opportunity, a fence post, a knocked-out vehicle, anything at known distance, using the impact to recalibrate his mental map of the weapon's current behavior. When ranging shots were impossible, when tactical silence was paramount, he relied on accumulated experience, on the uncanny sense he had developed for how the rifle would betray him and how to betray it back into accuracy. It was a strange partnership, man and weapon locked in a dysfunctional relationship that somehow produced results neither could achieve independently. Other snipers in his unit, equipped with rifles that actually functioned within specification, produced respectable tallies, 8 kills here, 12 there, numbers that reflected competent marksmanship and sound tactical employment. But none approached Curry's numbers, and the disparity became a source of both pride and subtle embarrassment. It was not that he was a superior marksman in the conventional sense. Several of his peers could outshoot him on a flat range with standardized equipment, posting tighter groups at known distances. Rather, he had become something else, a translator of imperfection, a man who had learned to see through his weapon's lies and extract truth from mechanical deception. His fellow snipers, carrying functional rifles, operated within the normal parameters of the craft. Curry operated in a different space entirely, one where the weapon was simultaneously tool and adversary, where every shot required not just marksmanship, but a kind of mechanical empathy, an understanding of how steel and glass were failing in this particular moment and how to compensate. The Germans began to notice. Defensive positions that had been relatively stable, where German soldiers moved with the controlled caution of experienced troops but without excessive paranoia, started hemorrhaging key personnel. Officers died in their command posts, radio operators collapsed while transmitting, the sudden silence mid-message sowing confusion through German communication networks. Machine gun teams lost their gunners, or more insidiously, their assistant gunners, the soldiers who fed ammunition and replaced barrels, whose loss rendered the weapon temporarily useless without being immediately obvious to observers. Mortar crews found themselves targeted during setup when the weapons were visible but not yet ready to fire. The pattern suggested not random American fire suppression, not the indiscriminate violence of artillery or the spray and pray of machine guns, but deliberate, personalized targeting by someone who understood German tactical organization well enough to identify high-value individuals and patient enough to wait for the perfect shot. German counter-sniper doctrine, developed through years of bitter experience on the Eastern Front, emphasized hunting in pairs, a shooter and a spotter working in coordination, using superior optics to identify enemy positions and superior training to prosecute targets before they could displace. They began dedicating resources to locating the American marksman who was disrupting their operations. German snipers, carrying their purpose-built rifles with their excellent Zeiss optics, began systematic searches of the American lines, sweeping likely hide locations with the patience that defined their craft. But Curry had learned fieldcraft in the hard school of survival, where mistakes were punished with death. He never fired more than 3 shots from a single position. Doctrine suggested 2, but he had learned that 3 was possible if he displaced immediately after the 3rd shot, before German counter-battery procedures could calculate his location. He used irregular intervals between engagements, never establishing a pattern that enemy intelligence could exploit. He positioned himself in locations that seemed tactically inferior, too close to German lines, at bad angles, in places that sniper doctrine would dismiss, but offered unexpected sight lines and rapid egress routes. When German snipers swept likely hides with their superior optics, methodically checking every position that textbooks identified as suitable for sniper employment, they found nothing, because Curry had already displaced, already relocated to the next improbable firing position where no sniper should logically be. By mid-February, as Allied forces compressed the Colmar pocket toward its eventual elimination, Curry's confirmed kill count had reached 61. The number itself, recorded in fragmented reports filed by his company commander, represents only verified eliminations, enemy soldiers whose deaths could be definitively attributed to his rifle through direct observation or post-engagement reconnaissance by infantry who moved through positions he engaged. The actual total, accounting for targets eliminated beyond confirmation range or during the chaos of combined arms operations where multiple American weapons engaged the same positions, likely exceeded this figure substantially. But military bureaucracy demands verification, and 61 was what could be confirmed through the evidentiary standards that the Army's documentation procedures required. Yet numbers, however impressive on paper, capture only the surface reality. The deeper truth lay in the transformation the experience worked upon him. Curry had entered the war as a competent rifleman with good instincts inherited from his grandfather and refined through training. The Colmar pocket refined him into something approaching a force of nature, a human weapons system that had integrated his defective rifle into his very nervous system, that no longer aimed in the conscious sense, but rather intuited point of impact through a synthesis of observation, calculation, and something that approached precognition, that had collapsed the space between intention and execution into something instantaneous and terrible. The symbolic object that haunted Curry's experience in Alsace was not his rifle, defective as it was, but rather the simple act of eating. American logistics in early 1945 operated at a scale that defied European comprehension, a systematic application of industrial capacity to the problem of sustaining armies thousands of miles from American soil. Even in forward positions, within artillery range of German guns, American soldiers received regular rations, K rations in their waxed cardboard boxes, C rations in their distinctive cans, occasional hot meals trucked forward from battalion field kitchens when tactical conditions allowed. The calories were sufficient, carefully calculated to sustain men under combat stress. The variety, by wartime standards, was remarkable. Canned meat, crackers, cheese, fruit bars, chocolate, instant coffee, cigarettes. Small luxuries that European civilians had not seen in years, commodities that had vanished from German rations as the war turned against the Reich. Curry would eat his rations mechanically, barely tasting them, his mind elsewhere, on the next mission, on his rifle's latest behavioral quirk, on the cold that never entirely left his body. But he could not help noticing what he found when clearing German positions after Allied infantry overran them. The enemy soldiers, many of them teenagers conscripted in the war's desperate final months when Germany was drafting boys who should have still been in school, subsisted on progressively meager supplies that spoke to the comprehensive collapse of German logistics. Black bread, dense and bitter, that crumbled like charcoal and sat heavy in the stomach. Ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, a simulation that mocked the memory of real coffee without providing any of its benefits. Packages from home, lovingly wrapped by families who had nothing to send, letters expressing love and worry, but no food, because there was no food to send, because German civilians were themselves starving as Allied bombing destroyed transportation networks and agricultural production withered under labor shortages. The contrast was almost obscene in its starkness. Here was Curry, sheltered in ruins that provided minimal protection from the elements, but at least offered shelter, eating processed cheese and crackers and chocolate before returning to the work of killing, while the men he killed died with empty stomachs, sustained more by ideology and fear than by adequate nutrition, their bodies consuming themselves to fuel the demands of combat. This abundance, this casual plenty in the midst of destruction, represented something the Germans had fundamentally miscalculated about their American adversary, an error that ran deeper than tactical or strategic misjudgment. The Wehrmacht had expected American soldiers to be soft, undermined by prosperity, incapable of sustaining the hardship that military theorists deemed essential to martial effectiveness. Early German intelligence assessments, prepared before American forces engaged in significant ground combat, characterized American troops as mechanically proficient but lacking martial spirit, as men who fought with machines rather than courage, who would collapse when stripped of material advantages. The assessment reflected German military culture's deep investment in the idea that hardship built character, that privation strengthened resolve, that soldiers who endured suffering became superior to those who did not. It was an attractive theory, emotionally satisfying, and catastrophically wrong. The assumption was that America's industrial capacity, while impressive in abstract statistical terms, could not compensate for what German military theory deemed essential: the warrior ethic forged through struggle and sacrifice, the spiritual quality that no factory could produce. The food Curry ate without thinking, consumed as mere fuel rather than appreciated as luxury, symbolized the fallacy of this assumption. American abundance was not weakness, but strength in its purest form, the material expression of a society organized around productivity and distribution at massive scale, a system that could simultaneously feed civilians at home and armies overseas, that could absorb the resource demands of total war without collapsing into famine. An army that ate reliably, fought reliably. Soldiers who knew hot meals awaited them at regular intervals could focus on their missions rather than their hunger, could maintain the mental clarity that combat demands rather than operating in the fog of malnutrition. The logistical superiority that kept American troops fed was the same superiority that kept them armed with abundant ammunition, supported by artillery that never seemed to run out of shells, backed by air power that dominated the skies with numerical superiority that German fighters could no longer contest. It was all the same system, the same overwhelming capacity to mobilize resources and project them across oceans and continents. The hot coffee Curry drank each morning came from the same supply chain that brought him ammunition for his defective rifle, bandages for the medics, fuel for the vehicles, replacement uniforms when the old ones wore out. It was a system of such comprehensiveness that individual components could fail, like his rifle's scope, without compromising the overall functionality. German logistics, by contrast, had become a patchwork of improvisation and failure, unable to deliver even basic necessities to frontline troops, a collapse that reflected not just Allied bombing, but the fundamental unsustainability of the Nazi war economy. German soldiers, starving in their frozen positions, began to grasp this reality through the direct experience of privation contrasted with captured American supplies. When German troops overran American positions in local counterattacks, they found stockpiles that seemed lavish, crates of rations, ammunition in quantities they had not seen in their own supply depots for months, equipment that was sometimes discarded rather than carefully maintained because replacements were assumed. These discoveries were profoundly demoralizing, revealing the vast disparity in material conditions that ideology could not bridge. The ideological narrative that had sustained the Wehrmacht, that German discipline and fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantage, that superior soldiers could defeat superior numbers and equipment, eroded under the relentless pressure of American plenty weaponized into military force. Every engagement reinforced the lesson. German tactical excellence, real and significant as it was, could not compensate for the systemic advantages the Americans brought to every battle. Curry's bullets, fired from his faulty rifle, were not anomalies in this system but expressions of it. Each shot represented not just his personal skill, but the entire infrastructure that had transported him from Pennsylvania to Alsace, that kept him fed and equipped, that allowed him to focus on the singular task of eliminating enemy soldiers while others handled food preparation, ammunition distribution, communication networks, medical support, vehicle maintenance, and 1,000 other necessities that armies require. The German defenders, by contrast, fought with progressively less support, less food, less ammunition, less hope. Their defensive expertise remained formidable. Veterans of the Eastern Front forgot nothing they had learned in that terrible school, but expertise unsupported by adequate logistics is a depreciating asset, a reservoir that drains with each engagement and cannot be refilled. On February 9, 1945, elements of the 30th Infantry Division broke through German defenses near the town of New Brzozk, effectively severing the Colmar pocket and cutting German units off from organized withdrawal routes. The breakthrough came after weeks of grinding attrition that had worn down German defensive capabilities past the point of sustainability. German units began withdrawing eastward across the Rhine, abandoning positions they had held for months, conducting fighting retreats that sought to preserve personnel even as territory was ceded. In the chaos of this collapse, as German tactical cohesion dissolved into increasingly desperate improvisation, Curry found himself attached to a platoon pursuing retreating Wehrmacht soldiers through wooded terrain south of Kuhnheim. The mission was interdiction, prevent organized withdrawal, inflict casualties on exposed enemy formations, maintain pressure so that retreat became rout. It was during this pursuit, in the forests that bordered the Rhine plain, that Curry achieved what his company commander would later describe in the characteristically understated language of military documentation as exemplary marksmanship under dynamic combat conditions. Over the course of 8 hours, moving with the advancing American infantry through terrain that shifted from forest to farmland to village streets, Curry engaged German soldiers as they attempted to establish successive delaying positions. The tactical pattern was predictable. German units would occupy a position, delay American advance with automatic weapons fire, then withdraw before being enveloped, leapfrogging backwards in textbook defensive maneuver. But each position they occupied exposed them to observation, and observation by Curry had become synonymous with death. His faulty rifle, by now so familiar that its defects were simply part of his targeting calculus as fundamental as windage or range estimation, barked again and again throughout that long February day. 36 confirmed eliminations in a single 8-hour period, a figure that strains credibility until one considers the circumstances. German soldiers exposed during withdrawal, often silhouetted against snow or skyline, targets at ranges between 100 and 400 meters where Curry had the most complete understanding of his rifle's behavior, a weapon whose pathology he had mastered through months of compensatory adaptation and tactical conditions that kept presenting targets faster than he could engage them. The psychological impact of this sustained precision on German survivors proved almost as significant as the casualties themselves, perhaps more so in its effect on unit cohesion. To be hunted by an unseen marksman, to watch comrades fall without warning, without even the sound of the shot reaching you before the impact, to know that any moment of exposure might be fatal, this eroded morale in ways that artillery bombardment, however destructive, did not. Artillery was impersonal, indiscriminate, a random distribution of violence that killed without judgment. You survived it through luck or proper entrenchment, and the randomness made it psychologically manageable. A skilled sniper was personal, discriminate, apparently inescapable. A sniper chose you, singled you out, waited for you to make a mistake and punished that mistake with death. The knowledge that someone was watching, waiting, evaluating, this created a paranoia that degraded tactical effectiveness, made soldiers hesitant to move, reluctant to expose themselves even when tactical necessity demanded it. German veterans from the Eastern Front, men who had survived the meat grinder battles against the Red Army at Stalingrad, Kursk, the fighting retreat through Ukraine, reported a particular dread of American snipers in the war's final months. It was not that American snipers were necessarily more skilled than their Soviet counterparts. Soviet snipers had refined their craft in the most brutal school imaginable, had produced legends like Vasily Zaitsev, whose tallies dwarfed anything in the American or British forces. Rather, American snipers represented something qualitatively different: the fusion of individual skill with overwhelming systemic support. A Soviet sniper might eliminate targets with ruthless efficiency, might operate with skill that approached artistry, but he did so in the context of an army that often struggled with basic supply lines, where ammunition conservation was a real concern, where medical support was primitive by Western standards. An American sniper eliminated targets while backed by an infrastructure that could, if necessary, level entire grid squares with air-delivered ordnance, that could call in artillery support measured in tons of high explosive, that operated within a tactical framework where individual snipers were one tool among many, rather than desperately precious assets to be carefully husbanded. The sniper was the scalpel, precise and surgical, but everyone knew the sledgehammer waited nearby, and the sledgehammer was always available, always supplied, never constrained by shortage or scarcity. This combination, individual skill nested within overwhelming material support, created a psychological effect that exceeded the sum of its parts. German soldiers facing American forces in early 1945 understood they were not just fighting enemy soldiers, but fighting an entire industrial civilization that had organized itself for their destruction, that could afford to support individual snipers with resources that Germany could barely allocate to entire battalions. By February 15th, when the Colmar Pothit was officially declared eliminated and German forces either captured or pushed across the Rhine, Curry's documented tally had reached 97 confirmed eliminations. The number was recorded in his unit's records with bureaucratic precision: date, approximate time, grid reference location, target description where observation allowed enough detail. 97 German soldiers who would never return home, never see occupation's end, never navigate the moral complexities of post-war Germany. 97 individual human deaths that, aggregated, represented a single American soldier's contribution to the vast machinery of Allied victory. The number itself is almost incomprehensible in its specificity. It is too large to be anything but abstract. 97 is a statistic, not a collection of individuals, yet too concrete to be dismissed as mere numbers, each digit representing actual human lives ended through deliberate action. Each number represented a moment frozen in memory, a breath held, a trigger squeezed, the sharp bark of the Springfield, the scope's narrow view of a distant figure crumpling, and then the practiced motion of cycling the bolt, brass ejecting, the next shot if targets remained. Curry, one of the most effective American snipers in Europe, consistently resisted turning his wartime experience into heroic narrative. In rare post-war interviews, he acknowledged his 97 confirmed kills and the defective Springfield rifle he carried, but refused to describe individual engagements or attach moral meaning to them. To him, the war was neither glorious nor shameful, only a task done under given conditions with imperfect tools. He rejected attempts to mythologize his actions, viewing them instead as the mechanical application of skill to necessity, and after the war deliberately chose an ordinary civil life, leaving his service behind without commemoration or pride. Beyond the man himself, Curry's experience illuminates a central paradox of American success in World War II. The U.S. entered the war with abundant industrial capacity, but weak doctrine, uneven equipment quality, and limited recent combat experience. Yet it prevailed by adapting faster than its enemies. American forces learned to integrate arms, modify doctrine in the field, and solve problems pragmatically rather than rigidly adhering to theory. Curry's mastery of a faulty rifle mirrored this broader institutional trait, success achieved not through perfection but through improvisation, persistence, and the freedom to adjust methods when reality diverged from manuals. Ultimately, Curry's 97 confirmed eliminations symbolize more than personal marksmanship. They reflect a military system and a society that supported individual soldiers materially, tolerated initiative, and valued problem-solving over ideological purity. American victory emerged from millions of such individual adaptations, enabled by logistics, training, and concern for soldiers' basic needs. In this sense, World War II was won less by flawless weapons or exalted doctrine than by ordinary people, backed by functional systems, learning to overcome imperfection through sustained, practical effort.